Hi, I'm Ari, and I'm an MCAT instructor and content developer with Kaplan. In this video, we'll be talking through some of the things you want to keep in mind when selecting a test date for the MCAT. In this video, we'll talk briefly about the basics of the MCAT. Think about how much time you should be setting aside for your overall MCAT study plans. To be talking about some of the most important components of your MCAT prep, which is reviewing your practice effectively, thinking about some of the resources you want to have on hand for your MCAT, as well as talking through a general study schedule to be able to put this all together. First up, let's talk through some of the big things you should know about the MCAT. The MCAT is indeed a very long test. We're talking about a full days to be able to complete through an entire MCAT full length. Here is a breakdown of what test day will be looking like, including all of the optional components of it. But you really shouldn't be taking any of these things as an optional. Like your break should not be optional, the tutorial not optional. Those are all really important things that you should be running through on test day. So don't make this any shorter than it really can be. Even though that time is optional, it's important that you do schedule out all of the components that are listed on the screen. And so in terms of the actual test components, there are 4 sections of the MCAT. We start off with the first science section, which is the Chem Phys section. There's a short 10-minute break. And then we come back for a CARS section, which is critical analysis and reasoning skills. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. There is a 30-minute lunch break, and then you're back for the biochem section. And then finally, after a 10-minute break, you've got the psychology, sociology section, also known as the behavioral sciences. So one of the big things that I don't feel like a lot of students factor into this is, really sitting down for the endurance of a, 7.5-hour test. And so that's why it's so important that you do build up to the level of endurance that is necessary to be able to sit through this entire MCAT. And so that's one of the big resources we'll talk about, is making sure you have access to a lot of practice tests. It's also important to note that, because of what this MCAT is like and how different it is compared to all of the other maybe tests that you've taken so far, that you space out the amount of practice so that, again, you're building up, but also getting aware of like the other components that a lot of people don't plan for, which is the endurance and the focus pieces. In terms of the science section, the MCAT is divided by 4 sections, but 3 of them are going to be science content based. And it's interesting in terms of this graphic with the bar graphs, the science disciplines are not going to be tested evenly. You'll notice that there is a bigger focus of biology in all 3 of the science sections, but the weight of something like, let's say, organic chemistry or physics is maybe not necessarily as representative of how a student would maybe divide their own personal time. For a particular student, they might struggle a lot more with organic chemistry and therefore spend a lot more time studying for that. But in terms of the weight on the MCAT, it only makes up about 15% of the actual science tested. Now, that is an estimate that is provided by the AMC, the folks who administer the MCAT. So, between test to test, you might see more or less of that organic chemistry. But overall, we should be basing the amount of time we study for a given science content area based on its yield, rather than, subdividing out our time relatively evenly for all of the science disciplines. So it's a good graphic to come back to, especially if you aren't as familiar with the way that the MCAT is run. And so make sure you're prioritizing your time, not necessarily on what you find personally challenging, but also gauging this based up against how the MCAT is actually going to prioritize that content area as well. The 4th section, which is the non-science related section, is CARS, which stands for Critical Analysis and Reasoning Skills. This might feel a lot like the reading comp style passages and questions that you have done maybe for other standardized tests, but CARS is a pretty different beast because only 1/3 of the questions is what we call or consider or classify to be reading comp. So those would be the foundation and comprehension questions. They ask about the content of the passage itself. 70% of the questions move beyond the content of the passage and ask about what we call the reasoning skills. So reasoning within the text, which is understanding the connecting pieces between parts of the passage, as well as 40% of the questions, which are classified under the reason beyond the text question. And this is where you are bringing in new information. Now, oftentimes students get a little concerned as to the relevance of something like CARS with, their future profession as being a physician, but the skills that you develop in learning how to do CARS passage analysis and answering those questions is a lot of what you'd actually be doing in a physician-like environment. You're going to be faced with a lot of new information. Your patient's going to throw all sorts of new things at you. They're going to give you a lot of history and background, and you need to be able to relate what you already know about like the disease, the symptoms, all of the test results, and then be able to align it with what's going on with what the patient is telling you. So, the problem solving aspect that is cultivated in CARS is, it is the heart of what it is to be a physician, this problem solver. So, if you are not a fan of CARS, I understand. I was also very much the same way. But the more and more I do CARS and teach it to other students, the more I appreciate the skill development that the section is warranting from students. Next up, let's talk about how to be budgeting the amount of time you should be setting aside for something like the MCAT. This is some data that was collected from the AUMC a while back, and I think you should pay attention to the date of this communication, which was November of 2015. So that is a long time ago. This was after they've gathered data from students from the very first year of administering this current version of the MCAT that you guys are all facing right now. And I think that's pretty important because their report said that they have students who spend about 20 hours a week for 3 months to prepare for the exam. And that rounds up to about 240 hours. And I think, based on the feedback that we generate from students, as well as, what a lot of students are aiming for, studying for the average amount of time is going to get you roughly to about the average, kind of score. And a lot of students are not aiming for an average score. They're aiming for something quite a bit higher. In addition, I feel like a lot of students taking that version of the MCAT maybe weren't as aware of how much more content was required for this version. The previous version of the MCAT didn't have biochemistry, psychology, sociology. So there's way more content involved for this test compared to the previous round. So I actually do think that is an underestimate number of hours. And so we do recommend at Kaplan that students aim for 300 plus hours of dedicated prep time. This includes like attendance of classes, doing practice tests, reviewing flashcards, videos. All of those things count towards your overall prep time. So to help you gauge exactly what that looks like for you, I've got a very rough calendar to help plan this out for you. So many times students are limited by a certain thing. So some students are limited by a particular test date, right? So if you're testing in, let's say 14 weeks, which is, about like 3.5 months, what you want to do is you take 300 hours divided by 14, and that should give you about 22 hours per week. Okay. And that's a solid part-time job. This would not necessarily be an easy thing to do if you were a full-time student or you're full-time working. 22 hours a week is a significant amount of time to be setting aside on a given weekly basis. So let's say you are not limited by a particular test date, you are limited by your current schedule. And so if you were to look at your schedule and say, you said, well, I really only have about 13 hours per week, what would that look like for me? When should I be booking my test date? So again, you take 300 hours divided by 13 weeks, and that should give you roughly 23 weeks, which is about like 5.5 months of time. So again, this is not a guarantee. The number of hours you complete is not going to necessarily mean that you are going to guarantee be at your course score, but it is a good way to estimate how much time you should be setting aside. The MCAT is not something you want to cram. You don't want to do kind of last minute. You want to plan it out in your own schedule and see how you can be able to accommodate for something like the MCAT. This isn't something that you want to do on the side when you've got a little bit of time, squeezing in a little bit MCAT prep. It doesn't work very well. I do recommend that students have a relatively, if possible, a compressed amount of time. So if you have the choice of like, I can either study for the MCAT for, 8 months for 10 hours a week, it would be maybe better to say, well, I can compress that down and do maybe 15 hours a week for a shorter period of time. Generally speaking, students make a lot more headway with a more compressed timeline if possible. But again, use your own schedule to estimate this. There's no right or wrong way. For myself, when I was studying for the MCAT, I had to do it over a much longer time span because my limitation wasn't a particular test date, it was my actual availability. And so gauge that based on, what is feasible for you. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Considering your own overall timeline, consider what time span would be suitable for you in addition to the availability of time. So let's say you're thinking, okay, I want to take my MCAT in about 3 months. What are the factors to keep in mind? 3-month time span would be feasible if you've taken all, or maybe just in the midst of finishing up your last set of prerequisites. And so by prerequisites, I'm not talking about medical school prerequisites. I'm talking about the kind of content you need for the MCAT. So a year of Gen Chem, a year of bio, a semester of biochem minimally, psychology, sociology, organic chemistry, physics would all be things that I would count as like the prerequisites for the MCAT. Now, I'm not saying that you can't study for the MCAT without having taken all the prerequisites. It does make it a lot more challenging. You're going to have to do a lot more self-studying if you haven't seen that content in a long time, or you haven't had a chance to quite do it yet, okay? So overall, a 3-month time span would be suitable for students who've taken those prerequisites. Your availability is something closer to the 20-hour-a-week time span, and you are relatively close to your goal score. So we're talking like less than 15 points away from your current practice test scores to your goal score. Goal scores are not an indicator or judgment of what you're capable of, but keep in mind that a goal score should be gauged based on the medical schools that you'd like to apply to. So do a little bit of research, take a look in state, in your local area, the kind of programs you're interested in. The location is a big factor as well. And since med schools have a pretty broad range of the median MCAT score that in a recent matriculant would have, it is important that you're doing that legwork. Remember, the goal here isn't a perfect MCAT score. The goal is to get into med school, and you want to use an MCAT score as a tool to get you to that school. Let's say that a lot of these things aren't a good fit for you. You haven't taken all of your prereqs, you've got a lower amount of time to study per week, and you're a farther distance away from your practice test. So in that kind of case, I would recommend more of a 4 to 6 month time span. So you're in the works of still getting through your prerequisites, or you're self-studying. Your availability is less than 20 hours a week, so you're around the 15 hour a week per less, and you are a further distance away from your goal score compared to your recent practice test score. So get that data, right? This is again not an indicator. You're not bound by the score that you're getting on your baseline exam, but it is important data to be able to gauge whether or not a certain kind of time span is suitable for your studies. Other things to keep in mind in terms of the type of the month that you want to be taking your MCAT. So a January, February test date would be suitable if you have a relatively busy spring semester. So you want to get that MCAT out of the way because you've got a really busy course load or a lot of work projects coming up. And so taking it early on in the year would be great for you. It's also suitable if you are thinking maybe on the off chance that score comes back and it's not quite what I'm looking for. There is enough turnaround time to be able to take it again before applications open in early summer. Another thing to factor into this is, let's say you've got a lot of work on setting up your primary applications. You want to dedicate additional time towards filling out that personal statement, securing a letter as a rec, all of that stuff, or you have a lot of other commitments that are going to be important for your overall application, like clinical hours and shadowing and scribing and things like that. So that would be a suitable test date for you, that January, February test date. If you are in the situation where your fall semester, right, the previous semester is really busy and you have a lot more open availability in the spring, then obviously aiming for a spring test date would be great. The retake is still feasible, but it is a lot more limiting in terms of a turnaround time. What I would not recommend you do is you are, let's say, testing at a certain kind of score, but you're not very happy with it. You're like, that's okay, I'll just take it again. Many med schools care how many times you take the MCAT, so it's important you're not planning for a retake, although I do appreciate the possibility, like leaving that window a little bit open just in case your score comes back unexpectedly lower compared to how you were doing in practice. But don't plan to take a retake, knowing that your scores aren't quite what you're looking for. If you are planning for a March, April test date and you want to build in that possible wiggle room of taking again before applications are really due, I do recommend that you actually continue to study as if you hadn't taken the MCAT, just in case, because a lot can be lost in the month time span that it takes for that score to come back to you. And the other kind of advantage for this spring test date is that you will know what your score is before you actually submit your primaries. For the MD American schools specifically, that generally open for submitting your applications at the end of May, right? You will get your scores back latest, just before that test date, the application is going to be open for submission. So you want to know your score before you know which schools to select for. This would be the right kind of test date for you. May, June test dates are kind of on the cusp of where it's going to get a little bit late for applications for that current cycle. So this would be what I would call the realistic last test date for applying to MD American schools. This timeline isn't necessarily as applicable for DO American schools or other international schools like Canadian schools. They have very different timelines. So, if you want to make sure that you've got a reasonable chance of getting that score in and applying for that current cycle, I would, go no later than, end of June, maybe even early July might be okay, but that's definitely kind of pushing the whole component. And then last up, we've got our July to September test dates. This is really nice for those students who have a very busy, fall and spring semester and can only realistically dedicate time to studying for the MCAT once they're out of school for their summer break. This is a lot more feasible for those students who've kind of cleared their summer schedule and they're looking for more focused study time. It's a lot more compressed as well, without a lot of school conflicts in the way. This is a set of test dates that I would recommend for applying the next cycle rather than the current cycle. Generally speaking, let's say you're taking it in August, your score doesn't come back until September, and that would be when technically your primary application would be complete. At that point, many students have already submitted their primaries, they're already getting back secondary, some might even be getting interview offers. And so due to rolling admissions with the way that it works for a lot of schools, the later you wait until you complete your primary applications with your MCAT score, the later it will be in the kind of pool of applicants. There might not be a spot for you, even though your application overall is pretty competitive. So again, keep that in mind. This is not this is a relatively general rule. So there might be exceptions for specific schools or specific programs that you're looking into, but keep in mind for just the general population, taking the MCAT, at the height of summer into the fall is going to be not great for submitting an application for that current cycle. Why does it matter so much that the MCAT is going to be something to aim for? For a lot of American MD schools, the application weight on the MCAT is significant. It is probably one of the biggest factor, even more so than something like the GPA, because it is a relatively universal component. It shows that you've got the academic rigor necessary to hold up throughout the course of med school. Aiming for a 515 and above kind of score puts you in a very competitive percentile range for a majority of MCAT schools. It increases your odds of admittance into the schools, and a lot of the top tier style of American MD schools are aiming for a very high competitive range. So, it opens the windows, right? You've got a lot more opportunities, a lot more selection pieces. So aiming for that kind of 515 style scores will be pretty important. Pitfalls to avoid, based on my experience with, working with thousands and thousands of students. The first thing is underestimating the amount of time that is required to get to your goals. I feel like a lot of students very much underproject the amount of time. They feel like it's something that they can do on the side, and always life gets in the way. Other exams, projects, work commitments, family commitments all get in the way. I'm not saying that that's a flaw on an individual. That is, it's important that you pay attention to the other components. I don't want people to clear their entire schedule just for the MCAT. But at the same time, if you're not planning for studying for the MCAT, it's just not going to happen. Something else will always come up. Another big pitfall I do see with students all the time is, let's say for instance, a particular student has 3 weeks available during their winter break. which is fantastic. But at the same time, 3 weeks is also not that much time in the grand scheme of 300 plus hours of studying. So depending on the holidays, to cram studying isn't always as valuable as it could be. You're often guilt-ridden with all of the other kind of family requirements, other holiday plans, family vacations, things like that. So oftentimes I feel like students get done much less than what they'd initially planned for. But if you put all your eggs into that holiday basket, it's going to, make the plans itself not as feasible. So keep that in mind, that, don't put everything into the holidays. Another component, which I've already mentioned, but I think it definitely bears repeating, is studying for the MCAT when you have time. Oh, look, on my schedule, I have 2 hours free between this class and this class. It'll be great. I can get a ton of stuff done. But at the same time, not factoring in the actual study time you need for your MCAT, your other classes, not just the MCAT, I think it's important that you're budgeting as much as you possibly can. Budget things like your breaks, your time away, budget things for your hobbies. I know it feels like you have to, deserve that time off, but I think it's important to pace yourself appropriately. That kind of schedule sounds like it's feasible, filling in everything with work, but after a couple of days or a couple of weeks, you might very quickly burn out. So it's important that you are pacing yourself. The final thing to keep in mind is you don't want to be comparing your rate of progress to how other people's are progressing. The MCAT is a tough thing. It is also very individual, depending on your background, your familiarity, your strength, your weaknesses, what you're aiming for. No two people are the same. No two study plans look the same. No two rates of progression looks the same. I've seen students who have all sorts of twisty-turvy curves with their scores. I see students who, get to their goal score in a very short period of time. And then conversely, I see students who take much, much longer. And so you can only really control what you put into your studies. Your rate of progress is something that is an outcome, but it's really much harder to control for that. So focus on what you can control for, like what the behaviors, the activities, time you invest into it. The outcome will come, maybe not necessarily at the rate that you would like, but it will come with time. A component with our Kaplan program that I feel like I wish I had when I was studying for the MCAT is a level of customization that tells me what to do for a given time block. When I was studying for the MCAT, I just had a set of books. I ignored everyone's advice about taking practice tests and doing a lot of practice questions. I ignored them because I had been out of school for such a long period of time, and it didn't really make sense for me to do a practice test when I didn't remember literally anything. And so I'm not saying that time was necessarily wasted, but I certainly spent way more time doing that kind of stuff than I should have. And I really wish I had people to talk to, a level of guidance that was not just dependent on my perception of levels of difficulty, but what is actually dependent with the MCAT. So with all of our comprehensive courses, you have a study plan that you can input in, let's say the number of hours you'd like to study per week, the days that you'd like off, your projected test date. You put all that stuff in, and then it spits out a schedule that is specific. It tells you exactly what videos, what questions to do, and it walks through the content, not just once, but multiple times so that you're getting that level of spaced repetition. In addition, it has the capability of advising you whether or not, you want to dig into the rest of the planned activities for a particular topic, or to skip the rest because you did great on that placement quiz, so that customization comes in then. You're only going to be focusing on the areas that is important for you that will increase your scores. It feels good to do quizzes on content areas that you are already solid with, but ultimately that's not where your points are going to come from. It will nicely, gently recommend that you move on to the areas that will get you the increase in your scores that you're looking for. So the next thing we're going to talk about here is utilizing your practice effectively. I think students are pretty aware of how important practice is, but I feel like the value of practice isn't just doing them, but it's about what you're gaining from them to inform your action steps. So we recommend that all students, right, regardless of their background, just to get some experience with the MCAT. So take a practice test. We have a free one that is available for students to take a look at and get a full-length experience. it breaks down that giant list of multiple years worth of an undergraduate degree into actionable steps, like content areas that you can target. So it makes it a much more manageable list. Next up, we recommend that you review that practice very thoroughly. Don't spend time on things that are, niche, outlier, low yield kind of content areas, but look for the repetition. Turns out that amino acids are really important, but maybe not knowing all of the, super low yield NMR peaks, for instance. I'm not saying NMR isn't tested on the MCAT, it absolutely is, but it's not nearly as heavily tested as something like amino acids. If you can analyze both the correct and the incorrect questions, I think a lot of students skip the correct ones, which I feel like, I understand why, especially if you're relatively short on time, but there's a lot of value in knowing what you already know and just confirming that really quickly from a review. Then from that list of review that you do, generate action steps. If you're relatively early in the process, picking your top 3 missed content areas from each of the science sections is a great way to narrow down that scope. Again, consider the priority based on how many times you missed questions that content area, and also keep an eye out for whether or not you missed it due to content or due to some other factors, like you misread the question or you didn't get passage support. Those are all very important components to keep in mind as well. By repeating this process multiple times, you will understand not just what the content is, but how it's actually applicable for the MCAT. You'll review the highest yield material repeatedly over and over, and then you will avoid spending a lot of time in low yield, niche, really small details instead. One of the things I appreciate a lot about the way that the Kaplan interface is designed is that it gives you an opportunity for a second shot. So if you take a look at the screenshot of a quiz in our QBank, you will see that it tells you what you selected. It also tells you what the correct answer is, but it doesn't actually show you right away what the correct answer is. So as you review, I would encourage you to apply this, what we call a 2-factor principle. Take a look at what was tempting about the wrong answer. Was it because you looked at a part of the question or a part of the answer choice, but you didn't fully read it? Were you thinking about different aspects of the content, so you're misapplying that? Did you not know some of the facts and you picked the answer choice that just seemed the nicest of the set? And then also take a look at why you didn't select the correct answer. Again, was it content? Was it some aspect that was not content related as well? And then having reasoned through, can you justify why the wrong answer is wrong and why the right answer is right? Then select C explanation. You will get a comprehensive explanation for all of the answer choices, as well as an overall explanation for how to be approaching this question better for you next time. Okay, so now what we're going to do now is take a look at a practice question. Not only are you going to give yourself a chance to try this out on your own, but more importantly, we'll talk about what the review process tells you about what your action steps should be next. So take roughly about a minute to try out this question on your own, and then we will review through this together. Okay, so let's take a look and see what this question is asking us to do. So the initial glance I take a look at is the answer choices, and I see right away that the answer choices are numbers, and so probably math is coming up. And the other thing I'll notice is that the units for all of these answer choices are in temperature with the unit of Celsius. And that perks my attention because I know right away that the information provided just above that, I see a unit of temperature that's in Kelvin. And so one of the things you want to look out for is built-in traps. The numbers are not randomly assigned, but instead they're logical mistakes that a student might make if they're not aware of doing a certain kind of step, like divide instead of multiply, or do a unit conversion, like some sort of metric prefix. And so I already know that if I have temperature in Celsius as answer choices, but I see Kelvin in the question, that there's likely a difference of 273 somewhere. And if I take a look, I see the pattern immediately. Answer choices A and C right away are off by 273 degrees, as well as answer choices B and D. So I know that if I make a mistake by not doing the proper temperature conversion, it's going to lead me to one of these traps. This is super valuable because being aware of that before you launch into the math is going to help you avoid making that mistake in the first place. Okay, so that's the first step. Is with math questions, I always look at the answer choices. Now, having kind of looked at those possible traps, the next thing I'll do is look up into the question and see what it's actually asking me to do. So reading through the question, it says, given the following data, at what temperature will the system be at equilibrium? I see some sort of possible phase change. And then I'm also given information about change in enthalpy, delta H, and change in entropy, which is delta S. So right away, I'm thinking, well, temperature, enthalpy, entropy, that sounds like a very famous equation that you do need to know for the MCAT, which is about Gibbs. So delta G equals delta H minus T delta S. So this is the equation that we'll likely be using. Now, I know that this is what I'm solving for. I am provided information about delta S and delta H, but I have a second unknown. So sometimes for the MCAT, when you see that kind of situation show up, it sometimes means that I'm missing additional information, like let's say from a passage, but that's not the case here. Another thing it could mean is that I have to incorporate in more than one equation. Now, it's possible that's the route this is going to get, but one of the things I will often do when I feel like, oh, I'm missing information is I'll read the question again. So if I take a look back at the question, it says, for the information provided, at what temperature will the system be at equilibrium? And that's the clue, that at equilibrium, when I'm at equilibrium, that indicates that the delta G is 0. In other words, it's already, the dust is settled, the rate of the forward is equal to the rate of the reverse, and so there's no Gibbs free energy change that is going to be present. So that means that I have all the information necessary to be able to actually do the math. This is where I actually start doing the math at this point. So I do a lot of scoping, a lot of like preparatory work before I actually launch into doing any of the math steps. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange this equation to solve for delta T. I'm going to do this in 2 steps. So the first thing is I'm going to get rid of the delta G since that is 0. And so that will be delta H equals T delta S. I'm going to rearrange this to solve for T, which is delta H divided by delta S. And then I'm going to start adding in my numbers. So for delta H, I see that it is 45 kilojoules, which is another thing to be unaware of. I want to make sure that I've got the same type of joules. So I can either convert both of them to kilojoules or I can convert back into joules. I'm going to go the second route because standard SI unit for energy is just in joules. So I'm going to turn this into 45 times 10 to the 3 joules. And so remember, a kilo is 1,000 joules. And then I'm going to divide that by 92 joules per Kelvin. Okay. Notice that I write down the units for everything as well. I used to skip that step just because I was in a rush, but I found that if I write down the units as I go, I'm less likely to actually make a math mistake. Now, I left it as 45 divided by 92 because there's another opportunity. You don't get a calculator for the MCAT, and so it is time to brush off those rusty skills of approximation, learning how to divide and multiply. Decimal scientific notation in particular is a huge component of the MCAT math, and so you want to be comfortable with doing this level of math. So I don't know specifically what 45 divided by 92 is, but I know approximately that 45 is half of 90. And so this rounds to roughly 0.5, right, times 10 to the 3. Okay, and that's another important thing is that you want to learn to treat the number in the front separately from the scientific notation that's over here. So I did this math separately. 45 divided by 92 is roughly about a half. And then I add the scientific notation back in, so that's on the top. Since there's none on the bottom, I don't have to change that number. And so that ends up becoming roughly 500. So here's the thing you want to keep in mind, that that's not in Celsius, because it'd be super tempting to look at the answer choice and say, oh, I found my answer. That is answer choice D. But this is 500 Kelvin. And that's why I think it's very important that you do keep track of the units. So 500 Kelvin is the temperature, but the last step I got to do is make sure I do convert this to Celsius. So I know the conversion, right? To go from Kelvin to Celsius, I have to subtract that value by 273 degrees. And so this is another opportunity for me to do more math than I necessarily might not need to do. And so I know right away that answer choice is D. That's the trap for not doing the conversion. And I also know that 500 minus 273 is definitely not 4. And so I'm left with these two remaining answer choices, B and C. So I can go ahead and do the math, and honestly, it's not necessarily hard math, but it's more work that I would be putting into a question that I'm already investing a lot of time into. And so this is the way I would like for all students to approach this: is instead of doing that math, look at the answer choices that's remaining. If I take 500 and I subtract 273, am I going to get a number that is below 250 or above 250? Since I'm subtracting a number that is greater than 250, the number I should have remaining is less than 250. So I don't know exactly that it is 216 degrees Celsius, but I know it's definitely not C. And so the correct answer here, from a strategic, efficient point of view, is answer choice B. Okay, so that's how I would be approaching a question like this one. I know talking through the explanation of this question took a lot more time, but with practice, the speed definitely does come, especially when you're trying to avoid overly investing in doing a lot more complicated math. Remember, on the MCAT, you don't have to prove your work. You don't have to do the math like you would for, let's say, a chemistry test. You just have to get enough so that you can select one of the 4 answer choices. And a lot of times, actually solving for the correct answer is unlikely for a lot of the math questions. Eliminating a lot of the other answer choices is often the most strategic, efficient approach to this. So let's talk through what we can learn from the experience of doing this particular question. So one of the things I do encourage students to do is to fill out what we call a hi-fi sheet. A hi-fi sheet is, it doesn't have necessarily a particular way of doing that, but I do think there's a couple of important components that I would like all students to be on the lookout for. So you can use this in a notebook, or you can use like Google Sheets or Excel to track this, but some sort of spreadsheet is a nice way for you to type up a lot of this information. So track, the practice test you did, or the practice question, or the quiz that you did, the question itself as an identifier so that you can refer back to it, the broad topic, the subtopic of it, and then why specifically you missed it. For instance, let's say you just did that question and you missed it because you forgot to do that last conversion from the Kelvin to the Celsius, right? And so you write down, oh, I forgot to do a conversion to put it into the right units. And so that's the first thing, is like figure out exactly what you're missing from the question that you just completed. The next thing you want to do is consider the level of miss. So a major concept miss would be like, I didn't even know what that equation was. I haven't done any studying of thermochemistry, which is the subtopic of the question that we just completed. I didn't, understand the differences between different types of images from lenses. Those would all be what I would count as major concept. So major concept is less about the importance of the type of content you're missing and more about your background. Do you understand what the terminology is in the question? Are you familiar, but maybe you just forgot it? That would not be what I would classify as a major concept miss. Then the next thing you do is take a look at action steps. So for a major concept, I would say you want to do a lot more in-depth review, checking out a book chapter, looking at some videos, getting the foundations of what that actually stuff means, that foundational information. That would be the thing to consider. Now let's say that it was less about a major concept and you made what I would call a strategy-related error. So for instance, if you missed out on that question because you knew the content, you knew the equation, you knew how to set it up, but you forgot that last little bit, you just made a quick error because you saw the number and it matched up to one of those answer choices, I wouldn't necessarily say that's a content-related error at all. That sounds a lot more like strategy. So forgetting the steps to set up a problem, even if you know the content, or you make a strategic error and got tied into one of those answer choices and assume that you were all done with the math, those would all be what I would call strategy-related error. And a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, the fix for that is effort into doing a lot more practice questions for that topic, but just being aware of the common types of traps. For instance, the type of mistake of not converting from Kelvin to Celsius is less about that content and more about just, maybe scoping out the math before the math is actually done, just like we practiced together a little bit earlier. The final category of mistakes that I would look for is what I'd call minor details. So for that last entry, we see an example of that. So let's say you are familiar with what a red blood cell does. You know that it carries hemoglobin. It doesn't really have a lot going on in there, but you didn't remember that fact that in the process of developing into a mature red blood cell, it essentially gets rid of all of its organelles to make space for all of that hemoglobin and the oxygen. So that's a fact that you didn't know or didn't remember, but you understand the broader context behind that content area. So does that require you to go back and review all of circulatory system and, red blood cell and the maturation and all of that stuff? Not necessarily, right? That could be a quick fix with a flashcard or a note and just making a regular reminder to review that information more. So try to do your best to categorize the levels of error that you're making, because they all have very different action steps that are going to be required for them. I feel like too frequently students do less of the strategy related identification and more of just assuming every mistake you make in the science section as a content flaw. And so they go back and redo videos or read through chapters, and that's not always going to help you with the type of mistakes that you're making. And the more efficient you are with matching up to the type of actual mistake you're making with the action step, the correction, the better that whole process becomes and the faster your score increases. I feel like the mismatch between the why I missed and the how I'll fix is often the reason why a lot of students plateau in their scores and don't necessarily make the gains that they're looking for. One of the features that I do feel like is very valuable about the Kaplan course is that it has a lot of extensive answer choice explanation. So there is a little tutor bot, like an AI tutor, that is available for you to access on any of the practice question pages on the Kaplan webpage. And so if you're like, I don't really understand how to do this question, explain it to me better, or give me another practice question using a lot of the same type of setup of the question that you see on screen, it'll actually spit that kind of stuff out. And it's a great way to drill and reinforce and get some additional in-depth knowledge. A lot of the practice questions have cool little interactive features. You can hover over things, or you can do little matching things. More than just doing more practice or reading through text, the interactive nature allows for you to explore different modalities of learning as well. And finally, what we also have is for some of the tougher practice in, let's say, some of the AIMSy practice tests or some of the more difficult passages and questions that we see in some of the modules, there are videos that walk through an explanation of how to break down the passages question as well as the background information. And so that is littered throughout the entire Kaplan course. And the videos can, again, be another way for you to explore different modalities of learning. So the next thing we're going to talk about here are some of the resources I would like all students to make sure they have a set resource for. The first thing is, I think on everyone's mind, is definitely the content. The Kaplan books are an extensive resource that covers pretty much everything you need for the MCAT. I do find that the books themselves often are misused or maybe not used as effectively. I think people have very grandiose plans of walking through every single chapter of all of the books, and that might not necessarily be the best way to study for the MCAT. So, for example, I also studied from the books. I did a very comprehensive review. I took a ton of notes. I highlighted things. But when I was done my content review and I took my very first practice test, immediately, even while I was taking the practice test, I knew the mistake I made. I had a lot of facts in my head, but I had no idea how to use them, how to apply them, how to connect them, which is a huge feature of what the MCAT does. And so I generally don't recommend that students read the books cover to cover. Instead, the books tend to be used best as a reference. So just like learning a new language, you don't really read a dictionary or memorize a dictionary. The same thing with the Kaplan books. And so as you do practice questions, you come upon a concept or a term or an equation that you're not so familiar with, utilizing the books to complement as a reference resource is a great way to use that. Additionally, there's a lot of good resources out there with practice with videos as well. This is a screenshot of one of the content refresher videos that we have planned out for students on our study plan. Having videos is another way to get that content review. They're often a lot more engaging, interesting. Maybe they got little anecdotes or stories or mnemonics to share with you as well. And so another really great resource is definitely a form of content review. Another thing that hopefully you are also familiar with at this point is the importance of practice questions. With our course, we have a Q bank. So this is a topic selectable bank of questions that students have access to. Lots and lots of practice questions available here. And so I think having a topic selectable question bank is pretty important so that you can dig more into the areas that you need to practice more of. Additionally, I think it's important that we do have access to practice tests. So the Kaplan course comes with a large number of practice tests that we do revise and update relatively regularly. They are score compared. They have a lot of statistical analysis to make sure that the scores are relatively representative of what students are going to be taking on test day. We gauge the level of difficulty. We make the same style and the feel of the actual exam itself. And so there's a lot of work and background into crafting these practice tests, and students have a lot of value. I feel like actually, as it turns out, that students have very comparable scores to how they're getting in their Kaplan test compared to how they actually do on test day. The last resource I think that every student should have, in addition to extra practice tests, is all of the AIMC practice material. And so minimally, I would want a student to have access to all of the AIMC practice tests, but they also have a lot of practice questions. So this would be not necessarily something that you can select for by topic. They do have them separated by discipline, like there's a biology, there's a physics, there's a chemistry, but the more updated resources, things like called the section bank, both volumes, those are the much more recently version of the practice questions from the AIMC, and they're a lot more test-like, as in, they are mimicking the type of passages and questions you'd see on test day. And I think it's important that you get that experience as well. And so I do recommend that students, if possible, have access to all of the AIMC practice material as well. So one of the resources I wish I had access to when I was studying for the MCAT was a level of guidance. I wish I had somebody to ask whether or not a particular topic I was studying was maybe very important or something that I could leave for a little bit later. Asking an instructor, what their experience is with some of the problems that I feel like students face throughout the course of their prep, getting expert level guidance for prioritizing different areas, for making suggestions on different resources. Those are all really important things that I feel like a lot of students might benefit from, and that is accessible through any of our comprehensive courses. We do have a lot of different kinds of courses. We have, live classes, we have on-demand, we have an entire team of tutors that are all happy to work with students on a one-on-one basis. We have an intensive boot camp program that is, really structured in a way so that you're doing, MCAT prep for, 5 weeks straight, full-time basis for a much more condensed timeline. We've got self-prep material, like you could purchase things like the question packs or the full lengths on their own. And so there's a lot of different ways to prep for the MCAT. I wouldn't say there's only one right way, but the level of guidance that a student needs is really dependent on their background and their preferences. So I would encourage you to explore different options as well. In addition to MCAT prep, we also have an entire team dedicated to helping students achieve their dreams with getting to particular med schools. So we also have admission consulting for applications into med school. So the last bit we want to talk about here is setting up, what are the things, now that we know all the ingredients, how do we put this all together? So here are some additional tips. First thing I would recommend all students look into is making sure you have access to a good number of practice tests. Ideally, 8 or more would be preferable, and space them out. I don't want students to say, well, I will save all my practice tests for the last month of my studies. It doesn't end up working as well as you think. You end up cramming them. It's like, doing 8 marathons in the last month of your marathon day. And so space them out relatively regularly, especially if you're like, I don't really know what to do next. Oh, probably time for another practice test. So for maximum improvement, space them out. It's okay that they're not regularly spaced out, but I definitely recommend students, start with a practice test, give themselves a little bit of time to review some content, and then when they're kind of done through their list, take another practice test and do them a little bit more frequently towards the end of your prep for sure. The next thing I would recommend you do is schedule regular study blocks. So like I mentioned earlier, studying when you have time isn't as effective as actually planning them out. And so look to, schedule out 3-hour block regularly throughout your week with a 10-minute break in the middle. So this is actually a convenient set of timing because that's the max amount of time I would recommend that students sit and focus for studying because it mimics a section length. So, a little bit earlier I showed you a graphic that laid out the different sections. Every one of the sections is between 90 to 95 minutes, so about an hour and a half. And so doing a section of 90 minutes of studying with a 10-minute break and another 90 minutes studying is essentially a half of an MCAT. So you can end up building up your endurance without actually going through a lot of practice tests studying in this sort of way. The other thing to note here is, again, plan for those study blocks. Don't look at your schedule and say, I can squeeze in a little bit of study here, or if I maybe reduce the amount of time I sleep, I can study a little bit here. Be reasonable and realistic with this. For every one of those study blocks, I would recommend you select a topic or two, depending on how deep you need to go, and focus on that. Review the content for sure, but also don't forget to reinforce with practice questions. The nice thing about the Kaplan schedule is that you don't have to plan all that stuff out for you. It'll map your way through all of the content that is required for the MCAT, give you that level of exposure with practice questions as well as content review videos. And so that's the nice thing about a course, is that it does all that thinking for you and all that planning. Make sure you're not just looking to see new things all the time, but budget time every week to review what you've covered. So head back into reinforcing, maybe with some of the notes or the flashcards you're creating. Maybe create another quiz based on some of the content review so that you're layering and you're getting that spaced repetition. Again, I want to reinforce that with the course, it already does a lot of that spaced repetition style review for you, but on your own, you're going to want to budget that in on your own. The last thing I'd recommend you do is make sure you are giving yourself regular breaks. So breaks doesn't mean, I need to study for my other class, or I'm gonna take a nap, or I'm gonna go to sleep, or I'm gonna do some meal prep. Like, those are all necessary things for do, but I think a true break is more about giving yourself what I call wakeful rest. So wakeful rest is engaging in something that you enjoy, but allows for your mind to focus on something other than studying or all of the other busy work. So a lot of times I see students, especially towards the end of their prep, see significant declines in their scores. And a lot of times it ends up becoming is that they're cramming the night before, they're fatigued, they're foggy, they're just super tired, very discouraged and frustrated about their lack of progress. A lot of times it ends up becoming fixed by just rearranging their studies so that they're getting a good amount of a break at the day before. So just like I would recommend a student do this for their actual exam, I would recommend doing this for all of the practice tests as well. So if you are interested in, having a lot more guidance so that you're not having to think through a plan for your own studies, consider, opting into a course. The analogous thing that a prep course I think has compared to just self-studying on your own, which is very doable, is kind of like getting a personal trainer or a gym membership. Oftentimes when you know that you've committed something towards a particular goal, you're much more likely to actually stay motivated and adhere to it. And so I've never been more in shape in my life than when I had a personal trainer and a gym membership. So for sure it is an investment, but it is, to me, one of the most effective ways to actually stay on track and stick to a schedule. So all courses come with a personalized calendar that you saw, all of the official AMC practice materials, so you don't have to purchase that in addition. A ton of practice tests, subject review book access. You've got the Q Bank, like I showed you a little bit earlier. You can drop into workshops, so 1-hour sessions that we run all year long that you can have access to with all of the great instructors. A lot of support with that AI tutor that I mentioned, tons of answer explanation tools, and way more than that. And so if you are interested in investing into a course, I definitely recommend something like this. It covers all your bases. You don't have to look for additional resources because it is an all-in-one package. To get started, I would encourage you to take a look at captest.com/MCAT to look at our various course options. And I thank you for your attention. I hope this was useful, and I hope to see you maybe in an upcoming class.